The cold afternoon dragged on in Los Angeles. The sharp wind swept through the streets of Skid Row, one of the most desolate places in the United States. Barron Trump sat in the back seat of his luxury car, lost in thought until something caught his eye. Amid the dirty sidewalks, between makeshift tents and faces marked by suffering, he saw a man hunched over, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket. There was something about him that stirred his memories, an uncomfortable, almost painful feeling. He frowned, trying to understand why his heart suddenly tightened in his chest. Life can change in the blink of an eye. Today, we live in comfort, but what about tomorrow? In 2 years? 5 years? A twist of fate could take us from the top straight to rock bottom. Barron knew this, but he had never seen it so clearly until now. He turned away for a moment, trying to shake off the unease, but he couldn't. There was something about that man he couldn't ignore. His eyes were sunken, his skin worn with time and sadness, as if life had drained everything that once made him shine. And then in a split second, it hit him like a thunderbolt. He knew who he was. The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. It was Mr. Henderson, his childhood school janitor. The man who had cleaned the hallways, who had believed in him when no one else seemed to care. He blinked a few times, trying to process the scene. How was this possible? How could someone so hardworking, who dedicated his life to keeping the school safe and welcoming for students, end up here, in this urban hell? His chest tightened with a crushing weight. Something was deeply wrong with the world when people like him were abandoned and forgotten. His eyes returned to the man, and at that moment, he knew he couldn't just walk away. The car slowed down at the red light. Barron leaned forward, his heart pounding, his mind racing. A lump formed in his throat as he watched Mr. Henderson struggle to keep the blanket over his shoulders, trying to escape the biting cold that swept through the city at dusk. His thin fingers trembled. This wasn't right. A voice in his head told him to keep driving, that it wasn't his problem, that he should return to the comfort of his routine. But another voice, stronger and more insistent, one that he couldn't ignore, told him that he had no choice but to act. Mr. Henderson's life had once been completely different. He lived in a simple but cozy house in Pasadena, California, dedicating his days to working at the school. Every morning, he would wake up early, prepare a strong cup of coffee, and get ready for another long day. His job wasn't just about sweeping floors or fixing leaks. It was about making sure every student walked into a clean and safe environment. To many, he was just the janitor. But to those who paid attention, he was much more. He noticed when a student was having a rough day. He knew which kids needed a kind word or just someone to listen. And he always made sure no one ever felt alone. He had pride in his work, even though most people never noticed. But life, like a merciless storm, swept away everything he had built. First came the illness, a cruel diagnosis that forced him to leave his job. Then, the most painful blow of all, his wife's sudden death. The only comfort he had left was his 2 adult children, who promised to take care of him. Promises that, in time, turned to dust. At first, they called often, checked on him, assured him they would figure things out. But as the months passed, the calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. When his health worsened, he had no choice but to sell his house to cover medical expenses. He believed that at the very least, he would have his children's support. But when he reached out for help, he was met with excuses and silence. They had their own lives. They couldn't carry that burden. Each rejection was like a dagger to the heart. That was when he realized he was truly alone. With no money, no family, and no strength left to work, despair consumed him. A social assistance, shelter, became his last option. At first, he felt ashamed, but he kept telling himself it was temporary, that he would find a way out. But life had no mercy. The shelter was a hostile place, filled with screaming in the middle of the night, constant threats, and a daily battle for food. He began to fear the darkness. Still, he endured, until fate decided to deal him one last cruel blow. A fire ripped through the building, destroying everything he had left. He lost it all. His documents, photos of his wife, a small suitcase of clothes, turned to ashes. That was how he ended up in Skid Row, the place where people lose even their last shreds of hope. The stench of filth clung to the air, and the streets were a battlefield between hunger, cold, and fear. He asked himself every day, how could a man who spent his life making sure others had a safe space end up discarded like this? The answer was too painful to accept. But the worst part wasn't the hunger, or the cold, or the illness. It was the loneliness. Nights in Skid Row were an endless nightmare. The cold cut through his skin like knives, and the hard ground where he slept was covered in dirt and discarded trash. Each night brought a new danger, violent fights, desperate screams, and the terrifying sound of footsteps creeping closer in the dark. He slept clutching a filthy old bag of clothes, as if it could somehow protect him. But nothing could. Danger was everywhere, and fear had become his only constant companion. He started avoiding eye contact with people. At first, he tried to hold on to some dignity, wearing the least tattered clothes, trying to wash up at public restrooms. But he quickly realized that none of it mattered anymore. The city had turned its back on him, and the world saw him as a problem, not a person. Whenever he asked for help, people looked away, crossed the street, pretended he didn't exist. Being ignored hurt more than the cold. As time passed, he could feel himself disappearing, fading from the world's view. He wondered if he was still someone, or just another forgotten body among the many lost souls of Los Angeles. Hunger gnawed at his insides. He never imagined a day would come when he'd have to dig through trash cans for food. The first time he did it, he felt a lump in his throat and a crushing wave of shame. But hunger was ruthless, and humiliation became routine. The rare moments of luck came when he managed to get a piece of bread from a kind soul or when a volunteer handed out meals. But those moments weren't guaranteed. There were nights when he went to sleep without eating, too weak to even move, feeling his body wither away. Time stripped away more than just his strength. It took his hope, his faith, his identity. Mr. Henderson, the janitor who had once taken pride in his work and looked after students, was now invisible to the world. Even his own voice had lost its power. He barely spoke, whispering only when necessary. His eyes, once filled with quiet pride and kindness, now reflected only emptiness. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on. But on that cold day, sitting on a filthy sidewalk, wrapped in a thin blanket, he had no idea that a familiar face was about to change everything. Barron Trump's car stopped at a red light, but his mind was elsewhere. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and his heart pounded as he confirmed what his eyes were seeing. The man curled up on the sidewalk, trembling in the cold, was Mr. Henderson, his janitor, the man who had once taught him more than just how to keep a school spotless. He had taught him about integrity, about believing in himself, about kindness. And now there he was, reduced to a shadow of who he used to be. Barron felt his throat tighten. He blinked a few times, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. But it was. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, ignoring the curious glances from passersby. Each step toward him felt heavier than the last. He had no idea what to say. No idea if Mr. Henderson would even remember him. His heart pounded as he stopped just in front of him and, with a voice that barely held together, said, "Mr. Henderson?" The man took a moment before lifting his head. His eyes were hollow, exhausted. But for a brief second, a flicker of recognition appeared. "Barron?" His voice was weak, almost a whisper, filled with both shock and something else. Shame. His eyes welled up with tears. He instinctively tried to hide his dirty hands, to smooth down his disheveled hair, as if he could somehow erase what he had become. But Barron didn't look away. Instead, he saw everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The past and present collided in a way neither of them had expected. Barron took a deep breath. There was no time to hesitate. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Mr. Henderson looked at him with uncertainty, like someone who had been let down too many times to believe in hope again. But Barron didn't wait for an answer. He simply extended his hand. And in that moment, without a word, a silent choice was made. Mr. Henderson hesitated before taking Barron's hand. His eyes darted between his face and the harsh reality surrounding him. Life had taught him not to trust, not to expect kindness. But there he was, a face from his past, holding out a promise he wasn't sure he could believe in. Shame still burned in his chest. He didn't want him to see him like this. But exhaustion was stronger. With a heavy sigh, he accepted his hand. It was the first time in years someone had touched him without disgust. Barron led him to his car. The silence between them spoke volumes. He saw the frailty in his movements, the way his bones pressed against his thin skin, the way he trembled, even in the warmth of the vehicle. His chest tightened. It was like looking at someone who had lost every battle and never had the chance to recover. As he drove, he finally broke the silence. "What happened?" His voice was softer than he expected. Mr. Henderson closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to answer. He told him everything. The illness, the death of his wife, the betrayal of his children, the slow and merciless descent into homelessness. Every word was a dagger to Barron's heart. He wanted to believe things like this didn't happen to good people. But reality was cruel. Pain doesn't choose its victims. When he mentioned the fire that took the last remnants of his life, Barron felt his throat tighten. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to lose everything, to have your very identity reduced to ashes. But what shocked him the most wasn't the story itself. It was how he told it. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just exhaustion. When Mr. Henderson finished, his gaze remained fixed on the window. Maybe he expected Barron to judge him, to say it was his fault, that he should have done something differently. But Barron only gripped the steering wheel tighter, a storm of emotions raging inside him. He couldn't accept that this was the end of his story. His expression hardened. There was something he could do, and he would, for gratitude, for justice, for him. Barron drove straight to a 5-star hotel without a second thought. Mr. Henderson glanced around, confused. He didn't ask any questions, but his face said it all. He didn't belong here. "Come on," Barron said firmly as he stepped out of the car. He hesitated. His feet were dirty. His clothes were torn. He felt out of place. But Barron wasn't going to let him resist. "Please," he said, holding out his hand again. This time, he didn't hesitate. Inside the hotel, people stole quick glances. Some whispered. But Barron didn't care. He walked straight to the front desk and booked the best available room. A hot bath, a fresh meal, a safe place to sleep. That was the bare minimum. Mr. Henderson wrapped his arms around himself, as if trying to hold himself together. When they reached the room, he turned to Barron and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" His voice carried a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Barron took a deep breath and smiled. "Because you never gave up on me. Now it's my turn." His eyes filled with tears. He wanted to say he didn't need this, but it would have been a lie. He needed it more than anything. He stepped into the bathroom and, for the first time in years, felt warm water wash over him. His fingers touched his reflection in the mirror. He barely recognized himself. When he emerged clean, wearing fresh clothes, with a meal waiting for him, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Dignity. He looked at Barron, and for the first time, he believed this was real. But Barron knew this was only the beginning. He didn't want to help him for just one night. He wanted to give him life back. Phone in hand, he started making calls. Lawyers, doctors, social workers. He was going to make sure he had a future. But deep down he knew the biggest change wasn't just happening to Mr. Henderson. Something inside Barron had changed forever, too. Weeks later, Mr. Henderson was almost unrecognizable. He looked like a new person, not because of his clothes, but because he had hope. Barron had helped him find a role at a community program helping underprivileged children. When he walked into that building, when he had the chance to make a difference again, it felt like part of his soul had come back to life. When asked why he did all this, Barron's answer was simple. He always looked out for me. Now it was my turn. Their reunion wasn't a coincidence. It was proof that small acts of kindness can change lives. And sometimes, the best way to show gratitude for what we've been given is to extend a hand to those who once lifted us up. Please don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories that are showing on your screen. For more stories celebrating real human values, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss our next uploads. Thank you for being a part of American Stories.